Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Thursday, October 20th meeting of the General Plan Advisory Committee. I would note that 8 of our 9 members are present, so we do have a quorum. The meeting is called to order, and we will begin, as usual, with a moment of silence, please. Very good. If you could all stand and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. This is a time in the meeting that's set aside for any announcements from members of the GPAC, any upcoming events or activities you'd like to inform the public of.
I'll do a quickie.
Sure.
We're doing a community Halloween trick-or-treat event, primarily in the downtown area, but we've also gotten some participation from the waterfront folks. It will be on Halloween afternoon, starting at 3:30. There will be a costume contest, lots of businesses participating in trick-or-treat giveaways. I think they're also going to do some judging of the decorations of the various shops. And I know the fire truck's going to be down there. There will be a map for who's participating at Grandma's Yogurt. So all kinds of fun stuff going on in the downtown after school. Everybody has to go to school still. Starting at 3:30. And it's kind of center on Grandma's Yogurt to pick up your map to start with. And the events will be pretty obvious all in that area. So hope to see all the kiddies out. And a few adults too with the children. Okay.
Sounds like fun. And the sugar high will start at 6:30. Any other announcements? Okay, seeing none, then we will proceed on down. We have no presentations today, so we have come to public comment. This is a time for members of the public to come forward and speak on any topic that you'd like, preferably having to do with the general plan.
Sorry, I keep telling myself I'm never going to be doing this again. But anyway, my name is Rigmor, and good afternoon, GPAC people. Chatting around with visitors and residents during the Harbor Fest about our centennial stairway combining waterfront with uptown. First of all, I could not find anyone who did not know where our downtown was or had problems getting there. They all liked a wide stair gathering place, plaza type area. Did not think an elevator was necessary or useful. Then I had a long talk with a handicapped couple from San Jose. He was in a wheelchair. She had arthritis in her knees. They had been to Morro Bay before and usually parked at the library. Had lunch at Shine Cafe where they liked to sit at the sidewalk tables to watch people. His wife would browse around in the stores. Actually, one of the stores she mentioned was Susan's. And they would meet at Top Dog Coffee House. From there, they walked over to Beach Street, where they usually go down to Embarcadero because his wife likes the solid handrails at the sidewalk. Going back to uptown to their car at the library, they take the trolley. The trolley also takes people in wheelchair, he added. They love to come to Morro Bay, easy to get around, not much traffic, and very friendly people. But he had a scenario that instead of spending money on an elevator, why not do what they do at some of the small beach villages in Europe, he said, where you have a good wide walking bicycle path built in a snake fashion to avoid the steep streets. He suggested there could easily be such a path made from the west corner at the Wetzel's parking area through the field and down to the triangular parking lot, where nothing has been built yet. Well, maybe that could be an idea to keep in mind, either there or somewhere else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else who'd like to speak? Okay, seeing none, then we will bring it back to the committee for the consent calendar. Item number A1, and it is the only item on the consent calendar, approval of minutes from our August 18th, 2016 meeting. Are there any corrections, comments, or issues with the minutes? Do we have a motion to approve?
I move to approve.
Second.
So we have a motion, we have a second. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 8-0. We have,
I was not present at that meeting, so I abstained.
Oh, sorry.
So it'll be
701. We have no unfinished business today, so we will proceed on to really sort of continuing new business, which is our discussion of the various documents that are coming forward. And I will then turn the floor over to Scott Graham to introduce the topic.
Thank you, Chair Taft. I think I'll turn it over to Michael Baker International, Jeff Henderson sitting next to me, so we can continue on with the review of the key issues document.
Thank you, Scott. And just a bit of a preview of the items that we'll be discussing tonight. I'm going to do a brief introduction and status update. We will continue the key issues and policies discussion. Followed by that, we will continue the vision and values discussion. And then toward the end of our meeting, Amy and I will do an introduction to the land use classifications that are used in the current general plan as a way of beginning the discussion of the designations to be used in the updated plan, and potentially also the potential areas within the city and the planning area that could be opportunity sites for future land use change, as a way of launching our discussion of alternatives. So brief status update on the project. We continue with the community outreach process, most notably through a workshop that was held last week in this building regarding the downtown waterfront strategic plan. A very well attended and spirited discussion at that workshop. And then in addition, you all still have the materials that were provided for community level discussion of the key issues and policies that are being presented in these GPAC meetings. We continue with the process of discussing the key issues and policies. We have hopefully our last meeting to discuss those issues tonight with the GPAC. And we are in the process of summarizing GPAC input on the topics that we've completed to date, and summarizing the input. We will then summarize the input on the topics that we conclude with tonight, and are working with staff to formulate recommendations to the Planning Commission and City Council that we feel are in line with the comments of this body, in addition to comments from stakeholder groups, in addition to comments from staff from various different departments, essentially bringing that material together to make recommendations to the Planning Commission and City Council, which we anticipate will meet in joint session. I believe, Scott, we're looking for a date in January at this point to bring that material forward for discussion in a joint study session of the Planning Commission and City Council. We're also now in the process of launching the analysis of land use compatibility, which is a process where we look at the existing general plan and the existing zoning map and essentially overlay the two and look for areas where there is potential inconsistency. And that's material that we anticipate bringing to you at your next GPAC meeting in November, along with some materials that we'll be discussing this evening, again concerning the land use designations and classification system. And then for the downtown waterfront strategic plan, we're in the process of finalizing the existing conditions documentation for that project, and writing up and incorporating the input that we received at the workshop last week to come forward with preliminary design guidelines and preliminary sets of priority projects or improvements for the downtown waterfront area, and then buttoning all of that up into a draft strategic plan to be presented again in sort of the January timeframe. So that's where we are on those pieces.
Yeah, I was wondering, I know you talked about identifying inconsistencies as far as the land use designations, but what part of the process do we consider changes in those as opposed to just the inconsistencies between the two?
That starts tonight.
That will be tonight.
Yeah,
okay.
That starts tonight, and I'll give you a little bit of an overview now, and we'll get into some details on that a bit later. Tonight, we're going to start the process by reviewing, just basically for everybody's sake, this is the existing structure of the general plan and the designations that are broken down in it. We also have a map that we'll be using to get some preliminary input from the GPAC on areas where land use change could be supported or is an important priority for the community. I really want to caution the GPAC to think about it in two stages. First, where could change occur, and that might be appropriate, and then what type of change. We'd like to really kind of consider that in two distinct pieces. So tonight begins the process of sort of the where of that, and then in future meetings we'll begin discussing the what types of change would occur. So, but before we get to that, let's finish up on the key issues and policies. Just again, as a brief overview, this is a working paper that was distributed to the GPAC back in, I believe, August of this year. And we're in the process of continuing to discuss a number of topics, which are a combination of things that were required by general plan law or the Coastal Act, important things that have come up in the outreach process, and really elevating the potentially controversial items for early discussion in the process. The report that you have in front of you presents a brief summary of background information related to each of the topics, has some brief analysis leading us to a range of policy options to consider and discuss. And as has been in the case in our last two meetings, we'll walk through the handful of remaining items and simply collect your input on those in the interest of moving forward with sort of a minimal level of summary, as a lot of that is covered in the documents you already have. And again, this process, as I alluded to earlier, begins with the GPAC and is ultimately then further refined by the staff, the Planning Commission, and the City Council to help us frame the content and direction of the draft general plan and local coastal program.
So, I'm sorry, if I could just clarify. So far, most of the work that has come out of your group and out of GPAC has been reviewed in these joint meetings with Council and Planning Commission, which really does not allow much time for discussion. At what point does it go through the regular process where it goes, Planning Commission and then City Council for more sort of detailed analysis?
Right. Our understanding is that will occur essentially at the public hearing process. So once we've got, and it could be that it's important to do that at least once in advance of that too, is at the point that we have, for example, a solidified draft plan and before we start the environmental documentation, just to ensure that plan is ultimately the project that should be analyzed in the EIR.
So that would occur at a public hearing of the Planning Commission and then subsequently of the City Council.
Yeah.
Do we have a time frame when that might happen?
At this point, we have not set a concrete date for that.
Okay, great.
Okay, so we are on topic number 14 in the working paper, which is historic resource management policy options. As I recall, this item really kind of originated from a lot of the discussion that occurred actually at the GPAC level concerning the potential importance of historic resources in the context of the general plan, potentially even to the point of incorporation of an optional element or optional policies in the general plan to address historic resources. I would point out that, specifically having like a historic resource element in the general plan is not a direct state law requirement. It is, however, a very common optional element that communities do pursue, particularly communities that are beginning to experience challenges to maintaining their historic resources, and communities that need perhaps a little more policy guidance to have a more detailed structure or regulations to address historic resources. And my recollection from our conversations in the past is that that's generally where Morro Bay is at this point, is kind of on that threshold of, having a number of potentially historic resources in town and needing potentially a stronger regulatory framework to deal with those. And so that's really the mechanism that's led us to the proposal of these 7 different potential policy options, which are all open for GPAC discussion.
Jeff, having the historical resource management section, if we choose to, we have it in the general plan. Does that help us in the future if we want to go after any grants that we have it codified or memorialized, thing that we've adopted as far as a city?
It certainly would.
I kind of knew that, but I wanted you to put it out there.
Yes, it certainly would.
I would like to thank you for putting this in here. Speaking as a member of this committee, but also as a member of the Historical Society, I have submitted to you in writing a revision of these policy options to put them in a slightly different order. Probably the first step is for the council to appoint a commission, a Heritage Preservation Commission. That in itself has some requirements because in order to reach the CLG status, you have to have certified preservation professionals on it, so it's kind of a challenge for a small town, but it would be the first thing to do. And typically that commission can help to draft an ordinance that would begin to institute a local register and set the city up to become a CLG. I would like to point out also, I have my colleagues in the Historical Society Board have reviewed this section, and what I submitted to you in writing includes some other things that would be useful to look at.
Right, and we are in receipt of that information, and it'll be incorporated in the comments. But to the degree that you would want to share that with your colleagues, I would encourage that.
Okay.
Could you give me a brief explanation of what each of those points are? For example, the Mills Act program, certified local government, et cetera.
Sure. The first item, the context statement, is in essence that is sort of one of the first steps in doing a locally based historic resource program, which is essentially a narrative statement documenting sort of the agreed upon history of the community that helps to define what are the important themes, what are the important characteristics, what are the important resources in the community.
So, Jeff, can we do that as part of the GPAC, or who would actually do that?
Typically, that requires hiring typically that is performed by a professional historic like an architectural historian, for example,
okay.
that works with the community and identifies those resources and places them in that context statement. So that's typically something that is outside the bounds of a general plan and would be something that would be separately prepared and considered and adopted by the council.
And I would like to emphasize that would come much farther down in the process. Once a commission is set up, there's an ordinance adopted, then the descriptions come later. So it's a while out.
So the first thing we do is decide if we want this to be an element or not, right? In the general plan? Or does the commission come first?
No, it could be in the general plan. We can do that now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it would. One of the things that would be nice to have coming away from today is GPAC sentiment on the level of treatment of historic resources in the general plan. Because it is sort of an optional topic, we're really looking to confirm, the GPAC's intent, if you will, with regard to how important this topic is in the context of the general plan.
So what's the Mills Act program?
The Mills Act program, and I might ask Glenn to expand on this. You may actually have more background in this than I do. But the Mills Act program essentially provides some tax exempt status for designated properties. So the city essentially opts to participate in the Mills Act, which is something that's afforded to the city by the state. And once the city has enrolled in the Mills Act program, individual properties can receive some tax exempt status if they are preserved or maintained in a manner consistent with the city's guidance.
Okay.
And I'd only add that is a California state program, and it does require those previous steps, again, to be
Okay.
taken care of so that you're eligible to be part of that other program. I would like to just say, of course, I think you can tell I'm interested in this element, and I would like to see it incorporated. As my colleague Victoria Berry has pointed out in my submission to you, the historic aspects of this town contribute to its tourism, to its appeal, to the design guidelines that we're working with. We discussed this in the workshop last week, where we talked about how the downtown and the waterfront might look. And one of the elements in that I think is important is to maintain our continuing characteristic of the city. So this gives us a basis for integrating these ideas of historic preservation into all different kinds of aspects of city policy. So I think it's a good idea, and I think we should definitely move forward.
I'm totally on board with that, Glenn. Having participated in that event last week, but also just from my own background, I think Morro Bay has lost a lot of cultural resources already, and having something like this in place and as part of our general plan gives any developer, any property owner, anybody who comes into town and wants to do something, it gives the rest of us a fallback to say, great and welcome, but here are the things that we're concerned about preserving in this town. Here's the character that the whole community has said they want to maintain, and I think any and all of this that we can adopt and add into the plan would be great.
I'd like to, I guess I have a question or two, but where we talk about tax exempt status in return for people upgrading their properties and maintaining the character of them, how much of that is optional? Do they have a choice to decide whether to do that, or is it something, or is what we would adopt, they would have a choice?
Yeah, my understanding is individual property owners opt in.
Oh, okay. And I guess I just have just sort of a background concern. I'm very supportive in this area. I have a background concern that we're concerned that people upgrade their properties, and that we have job development here and things like that, and we want to make sure that this should be done, but it should be done in a way that also promotes those other things. And there's going to somewhere along the way, I think, be trade-offs, and we may have to discuss that.
What would the possible downside be to adding this as an element?
Well, I'd like to just emphasize that when you look into these programs, most of them are set up so that participation is optional and it's incentive-based. So the city has to put in place policies that would either provide incentives to people to maintain historic characteristics or get reimbursed for them in some way. Okay. So it's not a force feed kind of program.
Okay, that would take care of a lot of my concerns in that area, and I don't also want to rule out if we have any particular prescriptive rules. I think some of that might be justified. I just think it's good to keep the balance in mind. But if a good part of this is voluntary anyway, then I think that you don't have to worry about it as much. The one potential exception to that, and it's really only I think a minor exception, would be the local register. Which what that does in essence is there's a national register of historic places and a California register of historic places, and properties are subject to those regardless, just by being essentially in the United States and in the state of California. What the local register does is allows the city to essentially expand and designate resources that may not be local or state. And once you do that, in essence, then those are also considered locally important historic resources. When a future project comes in, you need to consider those resources in addition to any from the state and federal. Okay, but then are they also subject to the voluntary nature of the designation and the restrictions that would be placed on it, or is there something else there? I mean, any property owner would likely need to essentially consent to the establishment of that resource as being locally important. And that is something you could certainly work into your program. Right?
So you're saying that any property owner needs to consent to that? What if you own a historic property and you're on this registry and you don't really consent to it and you want to tear down your building? Does that are there constrictions there that you do have to?
Wouldn't you still have to go through the planning process where there's going to be a panel of people who say that's not consistent with what we have established in our community that we want to be like? I mean,
So there's the program aspect of this, kind of like the Mills Act piece where you opt in. There's the other component of this that probably is our general plan telling us to do a historic preservation, come up with a historic preservation program that's policy driven and tells us what we do. Like it might say you should go form a commission, or it might tell you, it'll give you parameters for, it'll identify historic structures in town. And then it'll tell you what you can do when those properties come forward for redevelopment, development, additions, things like that. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and then that's not an opt-in thing. That's the community telling you we've identified this structure as a historic resource for the city or a historic structure for the resource within the context of our policy document. And these are the things that you can do when you want to expand and add on or build.
Just from having worked in cultural resource preservation, that sometimes seems like a scary thing. So say you find a prehistoric site on your property or human remains. Your initial reaction can be, oh my God, you just ruined the whole project. But if you go through the steps, you don't necessarily destroy your project. You may redefine your project. You may move things on it a little bit. You may... if we decide we really care about how Coalesce Bookstore looks in our downtown and we want to keep that, then you don't have an ultra-modern building come in there. If somebody wants to come in with a business and develop it, you say, great, but we're keeping that character, that facade, and perhaps what you do behind those doors is different. But, I think you have to look at it as a positive. You have to look at it as, wow, this is something to embrace about our community that we, in a way, have less and less of. I see in this town. I've seen a lot of historic properties taken down over time without review, without pictures, without even, any of the reports, anything that would go along with it. So, I think how we frame it, how we put it in our general plan, we can put it in as an asset rather than something that looks like it might limit development.
Okay, so the tax exempt thing, that's the voluntary part. But if the building's on a registry of some kind, there could be restrictions. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but I just want to make sure I understand that that's not an optional thing. That's something that can be done even if a property owner doesn't agree, and then they would be subject to certain restrictions potentially. Is that? I just want to make sure I understand what we're talking about. Is that right?
For the local register, I think what Scott explained is correct. My understanding is there are some, I believe it's one of the state registries that is not mandatory. You can actually, if you're a property owner, you can go on to one of those registries. There are other properties that I think it is mandatory because a government agency has decided that it should be. But I don't know if anyone else has more knowledge of that. I have knowledge of that because of a building that my family owns in San Luis Obispo that is not on a register that's at the state level, and there are people in the community who would like it to be. So I'm not the authority on this, but I know there are some voluntary registries.
Okay, but we're not deciding that right now. Okay.
Could you just explain the difference between a register and a resources inventory with regard to historic? I'm not sure I have that clear.
So the register is something that ultimately is a regulatory structure. So you're establishing and you're saying these resources, the city of Morro Bay, if it's the local register, the city of Morro Bay has deemed that these resources have value as a historical resource, which has special and significant meaning under the law, particularly under CEQA. And so that is the process of saying you use the local register to expand potentially the reach of the national or the state register. So let's say you've got a locally important resource, it's not designated at the state level, the community and ultimately the council at the point that this is designated, the community identifies that resource as locally important. That affords that resource certain additional status under CEQA for protection. The cultural resources inventory likely goes beyond things that would just be on that register and would include archaeological, for example, resources in addition to the historic resources. So
And
that's...
would that have implications for the CEQA process as well?
It could, yes. But not to the same degree as an established local register resource. Right.
So could this issue be handled, instead of having a new element, could this issue be handled under the visual resources element? Or would that not apply at all?
I think those are different categories.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, I would characterize, and I mean, I encourage Glenn to supplement what we're mentioning here, but I mean, I would characterize this range of options agreed in the sort of reordered structure that Glenn has suggested. I would characterize this as a fairly expansive and wide-ranging level of treatment of historic resources, and certainly the council and commission and even this GPAC has the ability to kind of step down that as far as you'd like to go to a level of comfort. But what we've presented here, we feel is sort of the full range of options appropriate to Morro Bay. And I think as Glenn has suggested, sort of restructuring this from the point of establishing a commission down to the more detailed level, you have the ability to kind of step through that to the point that you'd like to go.
And it sounds like that there's a fair amount of flexibility in terms of the degree of mandatoriness and also in terms of the mix of restrictions and incentives that could be built into an individual program.
Exactly. And even, I mean, the general plan doesn't have to decide all of those details. What it can do is essentially say, take these steps. And as you go from step to step, work through those individual details with a real focus on mandatory versus incentive basis. Right.
And I think that the process of drafting an ordinance would be a public process where we would be talking about a lot of these issues about
Absolutely.
what's mandatory, what isn't, how is it applied. So
Yeah.
obviously we'll be discussing it
Absolutely.
for a long time.
I think there's a requirement to have the cultural resource inventory of prehistoric sites. It's private. It cannot be put into the public domain, but the county keeps one, and I would assume the city does as well, because that should be a flag on any development. And if it's not, we're probably out of line with state law. I don't know.
I think it's maintained at UCSB, the one for this area.
They have a registry, but the county also, you can go look on their maps. Because I've had to do it.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I think that's not just, gee, we can ignore that here in this town. There has to, there should be sensitive areas identified, and more come up if we do develop any undeveloped areas. Pretty much in Morro Bay, everything's been hit at least once, but stuff still comes up, so.
So Bob, can we make that kind of a decision tonight, or is this something we need to talk about more as to whether or not we're going to add this element to the general plan, or what are your thoughts about that?
I think we can certainly make a recommendation. It's going to go above our pay grade eventually, but
everything does.
The presence of the issue on the key issues list is indication, I mean, at least to the point of the next stage of this process, that we're headed that way.
Yeah.
I think that the types of input that we've gotten from you so far on this issue tonight are very useful in the sense of, the consideration of mandatory versus optional or incentive-based, the sort of reordering of the structure to take a more stepwise approach in terms of detail and order of what stages you go through. And I think we've got what we need to formulate the next stage of this. And what I'm kind of hearing is, broad level support for, we need to take some steps toward a more constructive framework for historic resource preservation.
Well, I think, personally, I think historically this is something which has not been done. You know what I'm saying? That there has not been a very strong awareness of historical context. And simply putting it into the general plan is going to make a big difference in that respect. Particularly in this community, in order to bring that forward, I would be supportive of it.
I would simply add that this has been something that's been somewhat on the council's radar for, at least for the time that I've been here. They've been interested at a minimum of putting together a cultural resources and historic inventory for the city and what that might look like. It hasn't, because we're doing this right here, hasn't risen to the top, but it has been a point of discussion. It's something they've been interested in. So I've been picking around the edges at it for probably, the better part of 2 years, and seeing what that might look like and seeing where we might get help. And because I wasn't given funding to do it, it was just something they've been interested in. So I've been kind of looking at what that might look like. So these items are on point, and this is something that probably would be valuable to the city. And it actually, one of the things we run into is when we have structures that are sort of unmodified and they come forward for development, redevelopment, addition, things like that, and when they're over 50 years old, we typically have to require them, if there's not substantial changes that are evident that have been made to the structure, require them to do an historical evaluation of this particular structure. That's sometimes a $5,000 price tag associated with that to tell us that it's okay to move forward with it because it's not historically relevant related to CEQA. So having the inventory in place would identify these ahead of time and tell us what we're supposed to be doing with them. And I think so some of those houses that are 50 years old or older wouldn't have to go through that process. So there's actually positives to this because some folks get stuck in it and it's a surprise. They walk in the door and they've scrape together all the money they need to go through the permitting process, and we're like, yeah, we need another. You have to, pony up another $5,000. I mean, that's not a pleasant surprise for most folks. So,
yeah. And I would just want to add on. We've beat this to death, I think, but at our meeting last week, at least at our table, and I think I heard it on the summaries, we had a real strong discussion when we were talking about the difference, or the design guidelines for Embarcadero and uptown or downtown, that people in our table were pushing to recognize the historical status of anything that was in those areas. One person said, let's, as we move forward, and he recognized that we need to revitalize, but he said, let's keep 1 foot in our history as we move forward. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Parking. So, parking policy options. We have marked this as, this is a common theme that comes up in a lot of the community-based discussions, and we've also marked this as a Coastal Act topic because ultimately providing a range of parking options within the coastal zone increases the potential for coastal access. So that is, parking policy is one of the things that the Coastal Commission is concerned with regard to implementation of the Coastal Act. So we do have 5 topics that have been identified here as policy options, modifying minimum and potentially establishing maximum parking standards for different types of uses, consideration of paid parking in appropriate locations, potentially expanding the in lieu fee program for parking, encouraging shared parking, and continuing to monitor the demand for coastal access parking, ensuring that what we anticipate as potential shortages of parking are actually experienced by those who are accessing the coast.
So, Jeff, what's the in lieu fee program?
The city currently has a parking in lieu fee program that the council recently suspended to some extent. It was so if you had a parking requirement, say on the Embarcadero or in the downtown for 5 spaces on the Embarcadero, we probably don't want people putting in parking down there. It's a pedestrian-oriented place. You could come forward and pay for parking in lieu fees for those spaces. It was $15,000 a space. The council, while we're going through this process, suspended that, and for the first 4, it's free for the next about 15 months. And any above that would be $500 a space. So drastically reduced it. A little bit of an incentive for economic development there, and it's a limited time frame. It's going to be until we're sort of done with this process, and then it'll come back forward, and those in lieu fees will be in place, and we'll be looking at implementing whatever comes out of this process as our new policy, or working toward that anyway.
Is that the only place where the in lieu fee program is being applied, is Embarcadero?
Well, right now it's on the Embarcadero and goes up into the downtown. It's a designated area that's outlined in a couple of different plans that we have.
Okay. Thanks.
Can you, I was going to say, can you talk about I understand minimum parking standards. what is a maximum parking standard? You can't have, you put in too many parking places and like a parking lot of some kind? Okay, that's.
It's a strategy that's typically used to help encourage more walkable communities in terms of providing the option, essentially creating that incentive to walk from place to place, because you're essentially creating a shortage of parking. You're essentially disincentivizing driving short distances.
Okay, and then the whole paid parking thing, I've not heard a lot of support for going in that direction. We've had it up here as sort of a if warranted and some other things like that, but is there some reason, have you heard strong support for implementing paid parking here?
No.
Okay, I mean, it's like the zombie, people keep cutting its head off, but it keeps coming up. And
I would say that its application over time has been inconsistent, and so that in and of itself has generated a significant amount of angst between those folks that have had to pay in lieu fees and those that have not. We also have the situation down on the Embarcadero where the city has had recognized parking credits for previous uses on sites.
I'm not going that way. I was asking about paid parking. Am I misinterpreting what that means? Is paid? I thought paid parking was you have a meter and you're putting. Yeah, that was the nature of my question. I didn't mean to interrupt.
So the paid parking in this context is really as it likely relates to some of the areas that are more significantly impacted, say on those, during the summer on those weekend type timeframes, areas along the Embarcadero and things like that, where we could put paid parking in to increase turnover, maybe in the middle of the downtown to increase turnover, because one of the issues and the complaints that we regularly get is, hey, that store's employees park in front of my store, or the one on the other street parks in front of my store. And so you end up with a lot of employees that are parked in areas where they could be used for other things. So if we implemented a paid parking policy in some of these areas, it would force those folks to the outside and then create churn. So you have more folks that have the ability to park in front of the
I understand the theory of it, but I'm just wondering, is there a significant support for putting in parking meters in this area?
I have received positive comments for the duration of the time that I've been in the city to do things in certain locations to help with that.
Not in front of my store, but in front of my store, but not somewhere else. Yeah, okay.
I think the concept, which is fairly significantly supported, is the idea of enforcing parking limits. It doesn't make sense to have a 3-hour limit and then not do anything about it. And what Scott was explaining was that it's pretty inefficient to have meter maids out there enforcing it. It's a very expensive way to do it. Paid parking is a much more economical way to enforce parking limits.
I understand that the efficiency argument for it. I'm wondering,
I'm a business owner and a resident, and I will tell you from having sat at a lot of business meetings, a lot of people are very scared of the idea. I personally would love to see meters on Morro Bay Boulevard, a couple blocks of Main Street, and probably most of the Embarcadero. And again, it's so that you would have that movement. Like what happens in big events that we have on the weekends is that people will park their car on Morro Bay Boulevard all day. And they're down at the waterfront. They're not shopping. Our customers can't come in. We have a lot of local customers who shop in the downtown area and often are mobility limited. So they're having challenges coming in. So I just feel like it would create a flow. And we're not going to get parking meter maids, so it says 2 hours. Everybody ignores that. Just as a businesswoman, I guess I would say it makes sense to me to push the employee parking off to the side streets, or business owner parking off to the side streets, and allow that customer flow, at least in those spaces on the Boulevard and Main Street. And I think the Embarcadero, too. I think they get pretty jammed up. But it isn't, you're right. There's a lot of folks who don't like the idea at all. They say, but people come here because they don't have to pay for parking. Well, I'm sorry. San Luis Obispo is pretty busy all the time, and all of their metered parking and parking garages are full. So I don't really buy that they wouldn't
Okay, well,
come.
what I hear is people come here and they can spend the day. They can park their car and then go here and there and other places. They don't have to keep moving their car every 2 hours. They don't have to keep coming in and feeding me. Anyway, I'm just saying, if it looks like there's support for it, that's fine. I have not heard it myself, and one of the things I think it's very nice that we don't have it, but that's my personal
if you think about a business that's maybe paid that $15,000 per space in parking in lieu fees, but have no parking in front of their own business, and there's no way to create that with those parking in lieu fees. So that money disappears. It probably goes into some fund somewhere, and maybe a lot shows up down on the waterfront, in the Triangle parking lot. But there's nothing that helps your own business.
If people can park in front of one business and walk down to the Embarcadero, people can park somewhere else and walk to another business. And I'm just sort of, it's not like walking doesn't only go in one direction. So anyway, I didn't want to start a big argument about parking here. I was asking the question just because I haven't personally heard it. But if that sentiment does exist, obviously it can stay on the list.
Jeff, I think we ought to consider also that these things can be tangled up. You were mentioning about the walkable town. Is that the word you used? I think it was. And so right now we're talking about a walkable town. Then we're also discussing doing paid parking to limit the people staying in one spot. But if we're encouraging them to walk, that just by nature is going to encourage them to stay parked in the spot longer. So, and then if we're going to continue in lieu of fees that eliminate parking and don't have any language that takes the in lieu fees to go towards, instead of being dumped in the general fund, that doesn't go towards parking structures, then we're just creating a situation. If we're looking at 2040 for the plan, we're going to have to look at it a little bit more closely, I think, as far as what do we want? Do we want a walkable town? I think so. If so, then we're going to have to look at the parking requirements a little bit differently than what the basics here today. Thanks.
I'd like to suggest maybe a little bit broader look at this. To me, the concept of requiring on-site parking in the Embarcadero area and in the central part of the downtown is just crazy. Those, particularly certain areas in the Embarcadero, we don't want parking on those properties. So I would like to suggest the idea of, in certain districts, getting rid of the idea of on-site parking altogether in favor of parking districts. You can't have effective shared parking, for example. We've got lots of businesses that are open during the day and closed at night, and their parking could be used by restaurants and bars and theaters that are open at night. So you can't make that thing happen when your parking planning is going on lot by lot by lot. So to me, it makes sense, particularly in those areas, to plan what's the overall parking scheme for these areas going to be, not what are we going to put on this particular site. So I would, in terms of the parking standards, I would, look at not only modifying them, but probably eliminating them in areas where it's appropriate. And the other thing is, the current system that we have is crazy with this idea of grandfathered parking. I mean, it's nuts. It absolutely prevents certain types of businesses from opening in certain locations because the in lieu fees would be prohibitive. Whereas next door, because 30 years ago that happened to be a restaurant, you can put a restaurant now and have it's a nutty system. There's no other word for it. So we've got to that, to me, we've got to get rid of if we really want to encourage business development in this community. And the other thing, a couple other things, with regard to parking, we've got some really, really ugly parking lots in this town, you know. Many of them are owned by the city, you know, so it seems at least the city should follow its own design standards when it's putting in parking lots. Even the new lot, the triangle lot, is not landscaped. It doesn't include the appearance issues or the appearance requirements that are required by the zoning ordinance. And the other thing that that is absolutely just not true, guys, it says, Policy 15E says, currently adequate parking is available for coastal access. Maybe in some areas, but certainly in the North Point area, for example, virtually, 90% of the parking there is on residential streets, okay? And in order to get from there to the coast, you have to get across some fairly steep terrain. I mean, there's some really steep trails, not so much going to the beach, but going from the place where people park down to the beach. So even if we theoretically have the number of coastal parking spaces we need, the distribution needs to be looked at. It's not well distributed where people are using them. So those are a few things that I would add to this section.
One thing that this section brought to mind was the intersection with the discussion about the downtown waterfront strategic plan. Some of the proposals for that are to greatly restrict or eliminate parking in certain areas of the Embarcadero, which reduces the capacity to store cars. And it seems to me that makes this a very important part of your circulation plan. Since we're looking out 25 years, well, of course, we're all going to be riding around in electric automated cars in 25 years, right? But before then, people are going to get here in cars. So we're going to need to figure out someplace else to store them if we are serious about a downtown and a waterfront where it's pedestrian. People have actually suggested closing the waterfront except for delivery trucks at certain times. Can we think about a parking structure? Something that would actually be on the upside of the bluff, on top of the bluff, because it could draw people into both downtown and the waterfront, and could be a place where paid parking would make sense. So.
And I have a question too about listening to all this parking and in lieu fees and stuff, and about possible developments, redevelopments on the Embarcadero. And it was suggested when one of the recent ones was asked about parking, it was suggested that they had parking credits. What are parking credits? Are these the things that have accumulated over the millions of years?
Chair Jeff was sort of alluding to that. It's so some of the lease sites on the Embarcadero had other uses on them before the buildings that are there now came forward. And so when they evaluated the new building, and they went back and looked at what the previous use was and said, okay, well, you had some docks out here and however many boats you had tied up associated with the docks, and then your on-site use was, like you said, a restaurant or something, and then it came, so that the parking requirement for that use was 47 parking spaces. It didn't have 47 parking spaces because it had the restaurant sitting there and there was no parking available, but that was the previous use. So they forwarded those credits to the new building that they built that put retail, on the bottom and a restaurant in the back and something else on top. And they said, okay, well, the parking requirement for that is also 47 or it's 50, and you have to pay for 3 in lieu spaces. That's kind of how it worked, and that's how it's been recognized. It's been recognized throughout time. This 2007 parking management plan recognizes it, so it's been something that's been around for quite some time.
But then you could conceivably end up with more credits than there is area to have a parking places.
Well,
so doesn't it lose its value?
And they're credits, but the parking isn't located anywhere, right? So there's no actual. It just says, hey, you get this much of ability, you can have this much square footage or whatever it is, square footage or number of boat slips or what have you. And as long as you're beneath that credit limit, you don't have to provide parking, you don't have to pay in lieu fees, you can just build your new structure.
That's what it is. Okay.
But the effect is, if you want to put a restaurant into a building that used to be a dry goods store, okay, you may have to pay 30 in lieu fees, and it just becomes economically infeasible. So, in other words, what it does is it says, this building can never be a restaurant. It can never be a high-volume use because it's infeasible from an economic point of view. It's crazy.
Scott? Sorry.
The other thing is, did I interrupt somebody?
That's okay, go ahead.
Okay. I know we'll discuss this in the circulation element, but again, at our table last weekend, and since then, I've had two different business owners have conversations about, as we look at the parking needs, and you brought up the parking structure, we need to be looking at the increasing logjam of traffic going to the Rock from Beach out to the Rock. Is, we've only lived here full-time 2 years, owned since 2012, and that traffic in the last 2 years has gotten where it's backed up coming back from the Rock, from Beach clear back to the Rock. That's going to impact our tourism. And so as we're looking at parking, we got to, I think, remember or put that into the discussion.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Okay, any last comments or thoughts on parking? If not, that takes us to number 16, which I believe, yes, is the last one. View sheds and viewpoints, policy options. We saved the best for last. So where these recommendations are going includes potentially designating official view sheds, and that's not capital O official. It's well, in some sense it is. It's essentially saying, as a policy statement in the general plan, the following are identified as view sheds. Why that's important, again, is primarily kind of from a CEQA perspective, because then one of the things that you have to look at for future projects under CEQA is, does the proposed project impact any designated or identified view sheds? So what you're doing in the general plan is saying, these are the ones that are important to us that we want future projects evaluated against. So that's sort of the importance potentially of designating those view sheds. You're not required to do that. Typically what happens in a number of jurisdictions where that's not defined is what's an important view shed is then determined on a project by project basis. So again, you have this kind of the parallel example of what Scott provided earlier with the historic resources. And so I think it's really a question of, is it an important value to the community to identify certain view sheds as those official view sheds that we want to hold future projects accountable for protecting. And then from there, you could then create view shed protection design guidelines. In other words, provide guidance to property owners about preferred ways to preserve those view sheds. Potentially revising lighting standards to help protect views, particularly in the evening times. And then identifying degraded view sheds and other issues that are affecting view shed quality. In other words, identifying the places that remediation is necessary in order to recover potentially a view.
Hi, Jeff, I had a couple of questions about this too. When you designate view sheds, I mean, I can see it seems like it would be a beneficial thing for this, and then also on the historic registry to identify these things in advance so everybody knows kind of what to do. Does that prevent if somebody comes in and says, well, I'm not in a designated view shed, but somebody else comes in and can somebody else still come in and say, well, yeah, but you're going to ruin my view? I mean, I know there's been a lot of discussion about that. As a view shed, it seems like a broader concept than just a property's view. Is that?
Yeah, it's much broader.
What's intended?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so.
And I think we're talking about public view sheds here. I don't think we're talking about private view protection.
Okay, so this wouldn't, well, it couldn't property like on a ridge line or something like that could still be private property, right? Or is that, am I misunderstanding the concept?
That would still be private property. I mean, the
Okay,
concept
good.
here is, let's say, I mean, just for simplicity's sake,
Yeah.
let's say the Rock. And that viewpoints of the Rock, being able to view the Rock from different locations
Okay.
is identified as an important priority. Now, a future project comes in that's subject to CEQA. Part of the documentation needs to identify that that proposed project doesn't degrade or impact the public view of the rock.
The public
from these
view, okay.
elevations.
All right, but it doesn't have anything to do with if somebody's particular property, say, well, you're going to block my view of the rock.
No.
It's more of a,
This
it's a
is more
public
about the
concept.
public
Okay,
aspect.
all right, thanks for that clarification.
It seems to me the way that this was written that you're talking about setting up standards in the general plan to apply to projects that happen within the city limits. Because all of this discussion and examples that I've seen, that's what we're talking about. Is so, as Sean Green was talking about at our last meeting, preserving viewshed and view corridors. I'm interested in also preserving those view sheds as they are, so that when I look up on the hills east of the town, that's what I see. And I guess the question I'm asking is, if you wanted to look at it on the other side, and you look at the view shed itself, I mean the object in the view, and let's think about the specific one above panorama since it's in play. Can the city actually annex a piece of land and dedicate it to open space and simply say that's what it's always going to be? Is that a land use category that we could use?
In theory, yes.
In theory?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, San Luis has done that quite a bit in their green space. The thing you have to avoid is making it a taking somehow.
Correct.
In other words,
Well,
there
this is
has to be
reasonable use,
there has to be an
something like that.
agreement.
You need to preserve the reasonable economic
Yeah.
use of the property.
Right, okay.
That doesn't mean that you have to, that doesn't mean you have to permit building in it though, right? I mean, since Chevron wants to sell that property, if the city bought it
If
or...
the city purchased the property and then designated it for
Yeah.
open space preservation, that's legitimate.
That's
yeah.
it, okay.
It sounds like this is kind of the same approach as in our current general plan, which has a map with the little circles and, the problem is, okay, there are so many more views that are important, probably not to visitors, but to the residents. You know what I'm saying? In other words, when you walk down your street, and you look out and you can see the ocean, that's an important view to the people who live on that street. And it's a public view. We're not talking about from somebody's house. We're talking about from a public sidewalk or a public street. And those kinds of what I call small views, the views that are really, really important to the character of the neighborhoods, and so somehow the general plan needs to incorporate provisions that will protect those views as well. So maybe instead of having a map of what are significant views, maybe we need criteria for what are specific views that could then be applied uniformly to projects as they're brought forward.
I can see that kind of thing spilling over also to a public view, say down Morro Bay Boulevard, sidewalk signs, a parklet, the way you park the vehicles, those are all going to affect that kind of public view as well.
And the idea of having the map with the little circles on it, to me, it would take a tremendous effort to walk every street in Morro Bay and map out all of those views that are significant to the people who live here, but not visitors necessarily. I mean, visitors probably don't. I mean, they don't get up on Shasta very often, but to the people who live in those neighborhoods, they're very important.
Would that relate to the housing element at all in terms of the height restrictions, or maybe you can only obstruct 30% of somebody's view if they already have one of the water?
Well, but then we're getting back to private views.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's the setback rules, I think you can use for those kind of things. So you can walk down the streets and see things and not have buildings right there or signs or things like that. I think that would that
The problem is in order to do that, the setback rules would have to be customized for each little community. You see what I'm saying? In other words, setback rules which work to protect public views in one area would either be inadequate or excessive in another area. So you'd almost have to have setback rules that went block by block, you know. But if you said, this is what is a significant, call it a community view, this is a significant community view, and then tell the Planning Commission these need to be protected, then that's something that can be worked with regardless of the neighborhood. I mean, you know, especially because we have so much different topography. We have steep hillside lots, we have level lots, and it would be very, very difficult to write, in my opinion, to write zoning code that would work for all of those different circumstances.
Could you do something kind of generalized that sort of accepts, well, the ocean view, the view of the rock, the view of the estuary, the view of the hills, that we work as far as possible to preserve those views in the general public?
Yeah, it would be
public places.
Yeah,
like no development on the ridge lines of the hills that are...
Well, it would have to be a very thoughtful set of criteria, but I'm just suggesting that a criteria-based approach might be better than a map-based approach.
Criteria-based approach that has commonly accepted targets, if you will. So, I mean, and I think that's in essence where we were going with the maps and things that have been prepared as part of the CBA and those that are included in your report is, you know, understanding things like the Estero Bluffs, the Highway 41 corridor, Black Hill, the estuary, the sand spit, the rock. I mean, identifying those things and saying views of these resources are important to the community. Then allowing mitigation on a project-by-project basis to address those things.
Right.
Looking at some potential adjustments to different setback requirements or other zoning provisions to address those things all follows from identifying them at the general plan.
And it's kind of turning the current system around, because the current system really talks about views from spots, whereas we're starting to talk about views of objects and vistas.
And I believe from like a general plan level policy perspective, that's the right approach. Is saying, you know, what are the things the community values as targets of view? Then once we've settled on what those are, policies and mechanisms to preserve those targeted views.
It seems like some of the Coastal Commission regulations probably would help in this regard. I was doing some research on lockdown in the Embarcadero, and I noticed one of the things that in a proceeding there where they had wanted the building heights lowered because it would obstruct the view of the bluff from the Embarcadero. And so I think there may already be some help in those areas that we may just need to fill in some gaps there, but there may already be some. I've heard also that views of kayakers have views of the hills in some cases, and those are the kinds of things they're talking about. So we may actually be able to sort of start with what they have and then maybe fill in where we think there are some gaps.
Absolutely.
How would we handle, two questions. The first one is, how would we handle view sheds that we don't have now that may come up? For example, the streets, as I'm thinking about, I'm walking through town based on what you were talking about, Dr. Teff, and the areas where we have these large trees that are going to die, that hang over the roads and stuff. When one of those comes down, if we require someone to put something back in, when they come down, they're going to create a view shed that we didn't have. And then, I'm not trying to make it difficult, but then it's going to be a view shed that we'll want to protect probably. And then, so how would we address that? And yeah, let's do that one first. I'll ask my other one.
Well, if it's criteria based, then it would automatically be included in the criteria. Yeah.
Like in your. I mean, I think the view that you're talking about, if it becomes more available, there's still the views that we have out there are still going to be the same views. You'll just be able to see. Yeah, exactly. It's an improvement. There you go. That was good. Thank you.
But I think he's suggesting then if somebody wants to go and replace the tree and they get another tree that grows really big.
Exactly.
I mean, I know Pismo decided to put in those stupid palm trees? I'm sorry, shouldn't say that. But, I mean, as a landscape tree, it doesn't provide shade. It doesn't, I mean, to me, unless you really maintain them. But they did that so everybody would have this view instead of these lush green trees, and I wouldn't want that.
Well, I think what we're getting into,
why palm trees are used, queen palms especially, are used all over town.
What we're getting into is how do you craft the criteria? We're getting down to the specific. I mean, personally, I would see view shed as being maybe a larger concept that would include the trees. I mean, I think trees are nice to look at, So, but we're kind of getting, that'll be, I guess, a couple more steps down the road.
More fun for you guys.
My other question was, can you go a little bit more into detail on the revising the lighting standards to protect views? Having worked, in Escondido with North County, San Diego, we're all under the Palomar Lighting Observatory guidelines, so we're restricted. Are we looking at something that in depth, or explain it, please?
We are, essentially we would be looking at things like identifying the specific types of lights to be used, potential light shielding, things that are directed toward ensuring that light pollution itself doesn't degrade the view sheds. And
I think that's actually a really important clause to have in here and consider. I've talked to one local person, and maybe I'll see if she could come in and do a quick little thing on lighting pollution and what the damage it does to wildlife, to humans, to all of that. And yet we need safe lighting for streets. But I have another friend who lives in Atascadero who's had a terrible time with a neighbor who's gotten massive LED lights that are on all night long, shining directly into her bedroom window and into her hot tub outside and all of this, and can't get any help from the city on just shielding those lights. So it's not only affecting the wildlife and so on, but her life, her sleep habits, everything. So if we do establish sort of good neighbor policies, but also safe and efficient lighting policies, I think that would be an important thing we could probably all agree on.
Well, I do a lot of walking around town, and frankly, I know we're getting off subject because it has nothing to do with the view sheds, but frankly, there's a lot of places where it's really unsafe to walk because even though there's a street light, it doesn't actually light up the street, and it's really hazardous, especially where there's no sidewalks.
Back to the view shed.
Yes.
When I'm driving north on Main Street, I really like to see those hills up around by Panorama, up around there. But those are not in our sphere of those are on the state route. That's a designated scenic highway, right? But if it's private property and it's not in our sphere of influence, do we have any say over whether people can build on those hills? To protect that view shed?
So we can put in policies that protect those views up to the hills through the city. We don't have much of any say over what's put on those because they're in the county. We're hoping, though, that if we end up adopting some of the expanded sphere of influence areas that are in those locations where we have nice views of the hills, that we can put policy in place that puts people on notice that what the feelings are for the city of Morro Bay towards those. And so it would be something that the county would see if they were reviewing a development application for, say, one of those parcels on the Chevron property or something. So we can do that. We don't have any control over property that's outside the city limits related to what's developed there. An example is we had hillside view protection policies when I was in Pismo that talked about not only views to the ocean and down some of the streets that were perpendicular to the ocean, but also up those streets to the hillsides, because you have the hillsides at the backdrop to the city. And so we had to do, when projects came through the process that potentially had impacts to those, we had to do view analysis both ways and look at what that was, from looking up towards the hills and what it is looking down towards water. So certainly we could develop policies like that.
So the designation of being a scenic highway, Caltrans has already officially designated Highway 1 in Morro Bay as a scenic highway, it says here. Doesn't really protect that view shed in any way, or what benefit is that?
Well, when you have an area that's designated a scenic highway, then when development comes forward, it brings in CEQA into play, California Environmental Quality Act, as it relates to impacts to scenic resources. Then you have to do an evaluation related to that, and so in the LCP in the county, they do have view protection policies that apply to the hills, in this area, in fact. I haven't looked at them in quite a while, but they do have policies that pertain to what you can put out there, what it looks like, what its footprint can be, and those types of things, when it's within the viewshed of Highway 1.
At the risk of hitting the hornet's nest with a stick, I'd like to get an opinion from this group on the undergrounding of utilities, which obviously fits into the viewshed ordinance.
Yes.
I think that it would be, in an ideal world, I think they would all be underground because they are really ugly. I think that it would be a nice idea. I think there are matching funds, or at least there used to be matching funds available from PG&E, and I don't know the other utilities to do underground work, but you have to put up money as well. I don't know if that program still exists. It wouldn't be a bad idea to prioritize maybe some areas like where things that are seen from a long way away, maybe starting from the Embarcadero, moving up, or I'm just throwing things out there right now. But I think the question is the money there? And I think that it's just an economic issue. I think that you can't even fix all your streets. Can you really underground all the utilities? And there's a lot of trade-offs involved. Yeah. But I would definitely like to see us access some of that matching fund if we can spare the money to do it.
Well, we may also have an opportunity in the next few years as we replace certain aging sewer lines. I mean, it's a heck of a lot cheaper to put 2 pipes in one trench than to dig 2 different trenches at separate times. So, I just at this point, I'm just wondering if not that we can necessarily work out a program to do it, but do we endorse the concept that the city should actively pursue undergrounding?
So there are lots of options you have related to that. You could identify corridors throughout the city where you'd prefer to see. So the PG&E money typically they won't underground anything that's not 12 kV or above, and those types of things. And then they have to do. Then they require you to do full stretches because they don't want drops on anything that's over 12 kV. Because if you hit it with a car, it's not good. It can be bad. So there's limitations, and there's not a whole lot of money for undergrounding through their program any longer. But you could come up with a priority list for the streets in town where you'd like to see that happen. Certainly, we could focus. This group could give recommendations related to that. We could develop undergrounding policies within the neighborhoods. Are we undergrounding drops when new houses are built? When the infrastructure related to electricity or what have you on the lot is changed, then you do the drop off the pole and it goes underground from the pole to the house. We can certainly, look at those types of things. The city has in the past, again, inconsistently required undergrounding and then not required it. Unclear why it's changed over time, probably just because there was a bunch of pushback. But if we have some policy in our general plan that says, "Yep, we're going to do that," then there's no pushback, because if we don't do it, we're not being consistent with the general plan. It would probably also involve some sort of program to deal with sort of in lieu, because you can't require undergrounding across someone else's property. You don't have access to that, so we can't make someone give someone an easement. So there are some limitations, but where it's possible, we certainly could do it.
I'd be in favor of putting it in the general plan.
I would be in favor of setting it as a goal, even though we don't have a financing plan for it.
I would be in favor also. I guess Rob would probably know this, but there's usually the engineering department knows how much money is in the pot from PG&E. We had SDG&E, but typically I know in Escondido we were many years behind on the money that was available. But we could also, couldn't we put in language when we structure our agreements with Charter or any other communication type companies to make them underground their part, so that we're at least moving forward. And at that point, there's your chance, like what you were talking about with additional pipes. If Charter, for example, will underground a few blocks because they want to upgrade to whatever the newest things coming down the road in the next 30, 40 years, put in another pipe for communications is easy. They have different requirements, SDG&E and PG&E, for putting in utilities adjacent to water or sewer. There's a separation requirement for that, but the communication lines can all go in the same trench. So,
And there's certainly the opportunity to require it for, we're not going to have that many new subdivisions because we don't have that much land, but, for a new subdivision, I mean, the Cloister's undergrounded, that's, so, and, yeah, so.
Y'all remember what it used to look like? I mean, that made a huge, dramatic difference in what it looks like over there, I thought, when it was done, so.
Yeah.
When we first moved here, one of our neighbors tried to put a voluntary neighborhood organization together to underground in our area. And the cost is enormous. It turned out to be $7,000 or $8,000 per household, and more for some. So, but still, the neighbors tried hard to do that, and it was because there were a couple of free riders who didn't want to go along with it that it couldn't happen. But maybe the city could figure out a way to incentivize neighborhoods so that you get enough scale that PG&E, it's worth their while to take down some of these things if the neighbors have contribute to it. So they don't have to pay the full freight, but between the subsidies and their contributions and maybe some other incentives that can work out with the city, it could happen. And then there's a voluntary component to it that they help pay for it.
Yeah, maybe after you dig the trench and underground the utilities, then we'll come and pave the street.
That would be an incentive.
Good luck with all this.
So I think you hear an endorsement in principle at least. So.
And that concludes discussion of the key issues report.
Jeff, question now, housekeeping question as far as this. When will the changes that we've had over the past 4 months now be incorporated and available online for us to look at?
As we have those updated and available for the upcoming Planning Commission and Council session in January. That's, I think, the best guidance I can give. We have some work to do to summarize these results. We need to review those with staff and formulate the recommendations. And ultimately, that then will be made available to the GPAC along with the Commission and Council for purposes of that meeting.
Any idea of time?
I would say probably mid-December.
Okay. Yeah. There's a couple items that I've discussed with Scott that are just incorrect, and I wanted to make sure they were changed. So.
Okay. Very good. Okay, and with the chair's pleasure, I propose we move to the discussion of vision and values.
Absolutely.
All right. Where's the clicker? There it is. Okay, so basically we have one slide to continue discussion of the revised draft statement. I believe that you all received at least a link to the version, the updated version, as well as access to the track changes from the previous version. And this essentially time that we'd set aside on the agenda for GPAC to further discuss those changes.
We seem to be speechless. I hope that's a good thing.
Me as well. I mean, I would comment just as staff, with staff today, we were discussing the vision and value statement as well, and someone made the observation that, generally we feel like the statement has been very well received in the community, and that's just something I would acknowledge. Just kind of that's the vibe that we get through the feedback that we've had in various different settings, and I think the statement has benefited from the input of a wide range of different folks in the community, largely through the efforts of the GPAC, and I think we feel pretty good about the draft that's there now, and would be happy to entertain any further revisions requested by the GPAC, but we do feel like this is a pretty solid draft for purposes of moving forward with the project.
Is there a time when it is deemed to be final? I mean, how does that?
At general plan adoption.
Okay.
Yeah. At that point, it's kind of set there for the next 20 to 25 years. But yeah, I mean, it is part and parcel of the general plan, and therefore, subject to change right up until the final approval.
And I guess what kind of force does the vision and value statement have? In other words, are we accountable to address the issues that are raised in that statement?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, but likely not to the same degree as the goals, policies, and actions. I mean, the vision is really the overarching principle for the plan. So ideally, everything sort of flows from that vision. So to the degree that you're consistent with the goals, the policies, the actions, and those in turn are consistent with the vision, you're essentially implementing that. So it is in large part general. It's meant to be that, to allow for a lot of flexibility in terms of how it's implemented. But then those goals, policies, and actions start to really kind of tighten up the means by which it's implemented. I mean, it is. I guess I would, in summary, say it's not regulatory. I mean, the vision is not meant to be regulatory. It's meant to be general in character and to establish the direction for the plan.
I would see it as a tool that assists council members in making decisions.
Agreed.
The one-page summary.
Yeah.
But that does make sense, because if you're saying we cherish and conserve our natural environment and wildlife, and then somebody wants to come in and put a casino on the estuary, we can say, gee, that doesn't fit with our vision statement.
That doesn't fit with your vision statement, with the caveat that there could be a lot of different ways of achieving that protection and conservation. So then again, the vision doesn't set us down any particular narrow path. It says the wide path we want to follow is to preserve the estuary. Right.
I feel like it's a good starting point, and given that we've established that if we come up against something down the road that we just go, oh wait, that's grading, can we change that we could still do that.
And it's not uncommon for a vision statement to have some minor tweaks at the end of a process, just because we're where we're at in the process now. We're working with the information we have. We're working with the trends we have. We're working with the legislation we have. Things could change before we're done.
Right, and I think that's been the interesting part of the process, is we're probably all learning stuff as we go along. Things are coming up that may affect how we think this should be worded, but
Yeah, the thing that's rattling around in my head, and I'm sorry, I don't have a copy here, so I may be saying something that's wrong, but it seems to me that it talked about a diverse community, and I haven't seen anything. I mean, we've been at this for a few months now, and I haven't really seen anything coming forward that was specifically targeted at the concept of diversity. And I don't, and having thought about that, I don't know what that would be. You know what I'm saying? So
I'm not sure it's such a general concept. Are we talking about economic diversity? Are we talking about cultural or ethnic or what? I mean, I think I think it's almost, I interpreted that to be sort of purposely vague, that it would really depend on the context of what you were looking at. But yeah, I don't.
But then what is it, if it's that vague, what does it add?
It does talk about diverse housing options and a diverse economy, and then it is also used in that more general way about the population itself.
Right.
It was next to multi-generational in one of the things. I mean, I think we could all probably agree that in some ways we could consider ourselves a diverse community, in some ways not at all. I mean, if you've ever lived in some other, especially a city, we're not diverse.
No.
We're very much the same.
No,
But we're also looking at, what are we looking at 40 years from now, saying, looking back, it would be nice if we were.
but if that's our vision, then aren't we saying, doesn't that imply, okay, and in this general plan, we need to do something to make that happen? And my problem, I mean, I guess it's maybe just a lack of imagination, but I don't know what that would be. I don't know how we could do that.
All right, I would posit that we did, I think we dealt with some of those issues in the multi-generational community topic.
Well, if you're talking about age diversity, that's one thing. If you're talking about cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, it's a whole different story. You know what I'm saying? So, and you've already got multi-generational in there, so you don't need to say diverse in addition to multi-generational, if that's what you mean.
Agreed.
And actually, the second to last paragraph talks about our diverse housing, safe and eclectic neighborhoods. That, I think that gets to what we're talking about. There it speaks directly to diverse housing.
Right, no, that I get.
We can see that, we can visualize that, but I agree with you that diverse in front of multi-generational just doesn't it's too much ambiguity. My concern in all of the language in the vision and values is that as this comes together to an adopted general plan and revised zoning ordinances, that some legal beagle for a developer will come in and will they be able to, which one will trump? Will the actual language of the general plan trump the vision and values, or will a legal beagle come in and say, well, you say it here, so you need to let me do that?
It's a question.
I mean, it needs to be pretty tight, is what I'm getting at.
They should be
consistent.
consistent.
Right.
Yeah. They should all say the same thing.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. We need to make sure.
That's part of the problem. Part of the reason we're doing this is because right now they don't necessarily. Right. Yeah.
I would like to throw some doubt on the perception of diversity in Morro Bay. I've knocked on a lot of doors the past 4 weeks, and I think that there is more diversity in this city than a lot of us here recognize.
I agree. I think that the census data is about 13% of the city's population is Hispanic. That's not anything like LA, but we're not totally uniform either. No. One other comment about this idea of diversity here is this is a vision for 25 years in our future. What we want to say is that we're accepting community. We're a safe community, and that we are not going to be, we don't have to have anything in this plan that tries to recruit people to come here because they don't look like somebody else. But we do want to have a community that says, if you want to come here, how you look is not going to make a difference. So
now that's a good point. I like that. Mm-hmm. That's a very good point, Glenn.
That's good. Okay.
And I did look at our notes of who we got this input from, and it was the Open Space Alliance, and what does DB stand for? Downtown business, or so we do have some specific notes on one of the places where it occurs in the context of the population, and that's where that came from, partially at least.
Glenn satisfied me. That.
Okay, yeah, we'll definitely take that under advisement as we continue to look at the vision. Okay. Any further discussion of the vision and values, or shall we move forward? Okay, the last item we have for you tonight in our remaining approximately half hour is discussion of the land use classification system that's in the existing general plan, its relationship to zoning districts, and we did bring a map for a bit of an exercise this evening. We do, so I'm going to ask Amy to do a brief overview summary of the materials that you received about the existing general plan land use classification system. A little bit of discussion on potential. I think one of the questions that we would have at this point is, are there anything sort of obvious that's not already a part of the existing classifications from your perspectives? I think staff and the consultants have a number of perspectives to share on that. And then ultimately we'd like to move to the map and have a brief period where folks are identifying potential, what we're going to refer to as opportunity sites. So locations in the community where, as we consider a range of land use alternatives, areas in the community where the existing designated land use might shift. Places where change is anticipated and encouraged from the perspective of the GPAC. And ultimately, we would bring those together with a similar exercise with staff and use those as the opportunity sites for consideration of future land use alternatives. Our process of doing alternatives is essentially looking at different mixes of the land use designations on the one hand, on the opportunity sites on the other, and defining different scenarios that help to implement the vision and a lot of the topics that we've discussed in the key issues process to this point. So with that as an overview, I'll turn it over to Amy to do a brief overview of the land use classification.
Can I ask just a basic question
Sure.
to get started, just a clarification? Why do we have land use categories and zoning categories? They, in a strong sense, they seem to overlap and be redundant of each other. Why are those separate?
I would draw a parallel between the vision and the policies at the level of the general plan. So the land use designations are really meant to be broad in character. They're meant to identify, what's the basic type of use that should occur here. And at the most simplistic level, it can be, is it residential, is it commercial, is it industrial, is it some form of mixed use? And then beyond that, what character of development should occur here? And like on the residential side, that could be the basic difference between, is it predominantly single-family residential or is it meant more for multifamily residential? On the commercial side, it could be, is it really meant to be, service or neighborhood scale commercial? Is it meant to be more auto-oriented commercial? Is it meant to be, in this kind of environment, coastal or visitor-dependent commercial?
So then the zoning districts could be thought of as sort of subcategories of the land use?
Well, where the general
classification?
plan land use typically stops is at the setting of a density or intensity for the property, a range at a very general scale of the types of uses that could occur, and potentially height limits. Zoning will then pick that up. And potentially, it can be a one-to-one where you have one general plan land use designation that runs with one zone. Or it can be a one-to-many where you have, for example, one commercial designation that might be implemented by as many as 3 or 4 commercial zones. The zones then are going to begin doing things like establishing the physical dimensions of the property. What's the building envelope? What setbacks are required? What parking is required, what landscaping is required, and then more specifically, what specific types of uses are permitted there, or permitted there with conditions, or not permitted at a specific level.
But the zoning category has to be consistent with the land use category.
And the two have to be consistent one with another. So again, the land use designation, again, establishes those broad parameters, and then the zoning districts really dial in the details of what can you do on this individual parcel that's consistent with that general plan. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, Amy.
All right, thanks. And one thing we were talking about with the city staff earlier is you are, as we've mentioned before, in the unique position to be doing your general plan and your zoning right in sequence. So some of the things Jeff was talking about, it's often that you have a couple years or more in between the two. So we are sort of combining all of those efforts, which is pretty exciting. So just to refresh everyone's memory, the general plan does have 7 required elements, and then there can be some optional elements. The existing general plan has 8 elements, and we're going to be talking about the land use element in terms of your designations. You have residential designations, commercial designations, a category called other that includes a lot of different things, including mixed use. And I believe there's one other that I'm not thinking of, open space. So that's where we are right now with your existing plan. Sorry, let me jump to here. One thing that we've done so far is we have looked at your existing land use element and what categories are in there, what classifications are in there. We did identify that narrative list and the very old black and white map that's contained in there has some inconsistencies with the map that we're going to look at tonight. So we're working on making sure that's all consistent for the existing information. And that's partially because of the fact that it's such an old document and there have been some things that have maybe been cleaned up over the years. So we'll figure out exactly where we're starting from. But if you notice that while we're looking at the map, we are aware of that. And then we have included in this memo as well a table where you can see each of the existing classifications. The land use element has a purpose or a description of each of them. It actually doesn't include a purpose for the residential zones, but we've crafted one based on our understanding of what's in there. It does include the allowed density for the residential, sorry, not zones, but classifications. And then we have done our best to assess, working with the city a little bit, what the corresponding zoning districts are currently. And that may change a little bit as we move through the process as well, but we've got that in the table here also as a starting point. And like Jeff mentioned, we're looking for your input on whether there's anything that's just not on this list currently or something that really doesn't make sense to you. And then other things to keep in mind are thinking about how much housing you want to maintain in the city and thinking about what the state says on that topic. We have the existing housing element, and we can think about projecting out into the future what the numbers from the state might be based on historical trends in the housing element cycles. Other examples of where we might want to think about opportunities or change that we've talked about and heard input on already is how mixed use is defined in the classifications, maintaining enough industrial land in the city. So these are just examples to get the conversation going. And then Jeff is going to talk a little bit more about this opportunity sites exercise that we'd like to do with the map, and then we'll move around the map.
And I would just add to Amy's clarification, for example, on the mixed use designation, this is just one that we've had a conversation with staff about to this point is, the general plan identifies essentially a single mixed use designation. And it could be, and then as you look at how that's applied on the map, it sort of has occurred to us that perhaps that could be clarified a bit more in terms of its, that there are different types of mixed use that may be more useful or more appropriate to certain areas of the city than others. And in fact, there could be a mixed use that is really more oriented toward predominantly commercial use supported by residential. And there could be a mixed use that's more oriented toward predominantly residential use supported by commercial. There could even be, and we've seen this in some communities, a mixed use that is more the mixture of commercial and industrial without the residential component to it. And so there are lots of ways of looking at that particular question, for example, and this is just sort of one example of today there's a general plan with a single mixed use designation, and perhaps that single mixed use designation could be modified to provide greater direction on the intent for certain areas and better defined in terms of, for example, is it predominantly residential or predominantly commercial in character?
Can the state force us to exceed our population limit of 12,200?
No. Okay. No, I mean, and I mean, it's a complicated question. Certainly through the RENA process, there could be the requirement to accommodate a certain number of units. That doesn't mean you have to build them. It simply means you would need to zone land adequate to support them. So that wouldn't in any way invalidate that cap. It would simply mean, at the point that a project comes along that would trigger the cap, that's when that would be called into play. Right.
I know we have the cap of that Red was just mentioning, but Historically, do we have a data to project what our population would be in 2040? Because if you look at demographics, just, on Google, we've pretty much stayed 10,000 for 30 plus years. Is there anything that would lead us to think that that may change in the next 30 years?
Jeff's looking it up now, but it's a lower number than 12,200. But I think the point that the state, the Department of Housing and Community Development might come up with higher numbers somehow between now and 2040, and that could result in the situation that Jeff was describing.
Right. Yeah. The SLOCOG, the current SLOCOG projections for 2040 are at about 11,500 max. Right. So if those projections ultimately hold, then you wouldn't necessarily hit that 12,500 by 2040. But that's, again, a projection.
And the state doesn't require you to actually build all these units, right? They simply require you to show that you have spaces where they could be built.
That you have adjusted your land use and zoning regulations to potentially accommodate that number of units, right?
Does that mean if someone were to come in with a proposal to build, that would, basically if you say you have this land available to accommodate those units, and then if someone comes along with a proposal to do it, and then you say, well, I'm sorry, that would exceed, you can't do it. Right. Does that put you in kind of a weird position?
That's a good question as well.
Okay.
Untested water. But in theory, at least, you would have a zoning situation that would allow for that use, but that use is going to be subject to the measure.
So would that mean, say, the state's requiring us to have a certain number of residential units, and we're kind of built out in those R1 zoning areas already, that if we did a mixed use, say, in our commercial districts and said, well, gee, we're built out here, but we can allow X number of units upstairs above commercial, is that kind of where that would come into play, as that's how we increase our numbers of residential units?
It definitely could be, and that's one thing to think about when thinking about potential changes to land use classifications and then to the zoning related to what's allowed in an area, how much mixed use you have overall in the city, what your height limits are. So again, that's a little bit more in the zoning, but that could be one way to accommodate more housing in the future beyond, this housing element cycle or maybe even the next one. As opposed to purely vacant land, which is what is currently happening in your housing element. That type of analysis is what's mostly in there.
Seems like we have a lot of infill opportunities. I mean, almost every neighborhood has land, lots and things that could be used. Or at least a lot of the neighborhoods do have, lots here and there. And I think if you added all that up, it probably would be a significant opportunity without having to really change the zoning or the character.
And that's something that I didn't mention already, is that we have that map from the housing element. We want to add those opportunity sites to this map that we're going to look at tonight. It's actually on the next slide, I think, too. It's quite small up there.
Open another sort of ugly can of worms, maybe. But when I think about, our R1 districts and housing, and we have a requirement to provide a certain amount of housing, and if we have a certain number of conversions of those units to vacation rentals or VRBOs or whatever people want to call them, I mean, does that get subtracted from our housing that's available, or is that still included because, gee, it's a roof over somebody's head, even though it's, in my mind, more of a commercial use?
Yeah, those statistics would be updated in the census and reported in the next housing element.
So it could say, gee, we actually have less housing available because so many have converted to commercial use.
The calculation of so the number comes from the state and to SLOCOG and then to the city, and they may take that into account when they're coming up with that number, but it isn't always transparent to us. But we do report on the seasonal amount of seasonal, and
Well, and
so
to
forth.
follow up on that, because the vacation rentals, from what I've seen, are counted, they're lumped in as vacant units from, whether they're rented or not rented, or, So if the state says you need to provide housing for 200 more people, and we go, well, 20% of our houses are vacant, so all we need to do is move people into those houses and we're there. How does that arithmetic compute?
That's a really good question, and I know when I worked on the City of South Lake Tahoe's housing element, they had actually addressed that issue locally, and I'll look back at that and let you know what they did there.
We're also going to have to keep in mind what we just discussed before this part of our meeting is the parking. So if we're going to add more units upstairs to accommodate what the state's saying we're having to have, there's more parking spots we're going to need. So
That's actually,
it's all going to have to meld together.
that's been an issue downtown because there is, there are at least 2 apartments I can think of upstairs above a commercial building, and it just changed ownership. And the folks in the apartments upstairs are kind of like, well, where do we park? They don't have actual designated spaces anywhere in the downtown, but it's 2 households. Same thing around the corner. There's 3 vacation rentals that potentially could have 6 vehicles, nowhere to park them, right in the center of downtown. So you're right. That does raise, if you're doing that kind of mixed use in a commercial area, the parking comes back up again.
So we've provided the overview of the classification system just as a way of kind of warming up the discussion for the land use alternatives discussion. We are in the process of, we had a meeting with staff today to begin going through the classifications, and we'll be suggesting some modifications to those. What we'd like to do for the duration of time that we have this evening is essentially to invite the GPAC down to the floor. There's a map in the center of the table and a series of markers, and we'll meet you over there in a moment once I've described the exercise we're going to do. What I'd like to do at its simplest level is make sure each GPAC member takes a separate colored pen so that we can identify who has colored what on the map. And it's a very simple exercise. We are asking you this evening to circle areas on the map that you feel would be good opportunity sites for consideration of land use alternatives. 1 that jumps out, 2 that jump out to me as examples that we have discussed previously that we should certainly identify tonight. 1 would be the Dynegy site, the other would be the wastewater treatment plant, for example. 2 examples. But I'd encourage you to kind of think creatively, and it's not just sites; it can be corridors. If there's a corridor in town that you feel like, maybe the mix of uses that's there today could benefit from us considering some other options, I'd identify to you to circle or highlight that corridor, and to just kind of take a bit of a free form to that this evening. Again, with the objective for this evening being identifying places where change could occur and would likely be beneficial for the community, not what change. And in the future, we're going to look at a range of different options for a series of these sites to allow us to discuss some of the trade-offs of the different types of uses. So for tonight, it's a matter of identifying, what are the sites where potential change could be welcomed or encouraged.
So for purposes of this exercise, you want us to pretend that these land use categories are real? Because what's happened here in Morro Bay over the years is that they have been corrupted by laying on PD overlays, laying on R overlays, so that in large areas of town, the land use category that's designated is not really what's being applied.
Right, and those are corrections that we're going to be making through this process.
Are we going to get rid of all that overlay stuff?
That remains to be determined. But I mean, one of the intents of the process in a general plan update like this is to, it's the opportunity once every 20 years to kind of refresh everything. To say, yeah, okay, there've been some map changes over the years that have crept in and to sort of mess up the situation. Part of what we're doing now is the process of saying, what are the general plan designations and what are their corresponding zones? What are they on the maps? Are the maps consistent one with another? And we go through the process at this time of doing those cleanups in the interest of emerging from the process with a clean list of land use designations, a clean list of zoning districts, good correspondence between them, and 2 maps that are consistent one with the other. That's the objective. Is it all perfect right now? No. But we're in the process of working through those cleanups.
Jeff, I'm assuming we need to stay within the current boundaries of the city and not anything like...
You will see, and as you get down to the map, but on the version that's on the screen, you'll see a big blue line that goes around the outside. This is in essence reflective of the feedback that you gave us on the very first key issues discussion about potential areas to include inside a planning area. When you get to the map, you'll see that a portion of that line is dashed south of Highway 41, and that represents the potential eastern edge of study area 2 from our previous discussion. One of the things we noted from that discussion is there's not really a clear picture about how far out that one should go. So for the moment, we're representing that with a dashed line indicating, that's not really been fully recommended or determined at this point. But to answer your question, we would entertain drawing anywhere within that blue line, not just the existing city limits.
Can you circulate around a better map? I know there's probably some available on the city website somewhere, but it would be better to have. I mean, this is fine for today. I'm sure you've got something there, and we have 5 minutes left, so we should get to it. But it'd be good to get something a little bit better.
Agreed.
One more question, curiosity before we go. On this land use, general plan land use designation, you have a golf course listed, and it says golf courses and related facilities. On the land use map, you have the state park included down by Parkview Drive. Is that, I thought that was state park land. Do we have any say over that?
There's a golf course.
Yes, so the city does actually have classifications and zoning districts on state land, and that is because the city has permitting jurisdiction through the Coastal Commission over those lands, and so that's our understanding of why that has happened in Morro Bay. Okay. But it doesn't mean that, well, I don't know if Scott wants to follow up on that at all in terms of what the state has authorization over.
I think we also have golf course zoning over the cloisters.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, it's something. The zoning's old. I mean, that's why we're doing this now, is to go up and sort of fix it. I mean, so you're going to see categories sometimes like that don't make a whole lot of sense because those properties that weren't developed back when this plan was adopted initially are now developed.
Okay. You're actually raising a pretty good textbook example of the difference between general plan and zoning. For example, designating something golf course at the general plan level may not be as helpful as designating it recreation. And then maybe at the zoning level, you have differences between different types of recreation with different development standards and requirements. So that's a very good, I think, example of, here in this table, currently the general plan has golf course, the zoning has golf course. It might make sense to fold that general plan up into something more descriptive of the range of potential use, or the end use, if you will, which is essentially recreation.
I know we have not that much time left, but if you feel like you've already given your input on this issue in the downtown, we would encourage you to focus on other areas that we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, the downtown waterfront strategic plans had a whole series of workshops identifying opportunity sites. That'll all fold in. So I would encourage maximizing the time elsewhere on the map. Okay, come on down.
How's it going?
So far, so good.
So what would happen if we decided to rezone the golf course as visitor serving commercial, say? The state would send the National Guard?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, exactly. I don't
All
know.
hell would break loose.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Pretty good. How are you?
Where's the sewer pad on that matter?
It's the okay. So this is 9G. That's the sewer pad. The new one is over here. There's an update for that. That's Southman Boulevard right there. And then once you get outside the city limits, right on the edge. Yeah. Yeah. There's like a knoll there and it's sitting behind that. No one needs to
Are they letting you guys have the colored pens?
No, we just want to watch.
Tell me what to do. Are they doing more of a?
You haven't marked it up?
I like the theater. Right, so this line here is Main Street, as you can see, so it's up there.
So we could put a 7-Eleven in there.
So that was the category of
Yeah. I mean, maybe it would be successful. Well, that's it. You guys want to be on the set so you're closer?
Okay, and that's it for tonight.
Okay, well, we proved that none of us are artistic. So we will move on then to closing member comments from the committee. Are there any? And seeing none, we will go to community development and Michael Baker for next steps.
All right, I'll just briefly summarize next steps. Our next GPAC meeting is scheduled for November the 17th. Some of the things that are in process now is we're going to incorporate some of the ideas that you've had for opportunity sites with a similar discussion and exercise that we're doing with staff, and essentially bring those together into identifying sort of discrete locations in the city that would be the subject for the land use alternatives. And we're going to begin the process of defining what some of those alternatives may be and begin that discussion on November the 17th. We also still do have in reserve the items on the CBA and the CVRA to bring back to the GPAC. It's unclear at this point whether that will be ripe for consideration in November or December, but it is our intention to bring those back as quickly as possible. Awaiting the revisions. Essentially, we're awaiting the revisions to the economic development chapter in order to bring that back to you in a complete set of the information. And then ultimately, we're working toward a planning commission and city council study session, as I'd indicated earlier, roughly in the January timeframe. We're looking for dates for that at this point.
Is the meeting in December also the third Thursday?
It is the third Thursday, and I think we were just looking at that last week. I think we determined it was the 15th or the 17th. So it's clear of the week of
the 15th. Yeah, I thought so. That's why I was just asking. Thanks.
Right.
Yeah, so we had discussed whether or not to pull that one earlier or just defer it, and from a staff perspective, we'd like to go ahead and keep that December meeting for momentum. And that concludes our updates.
And with that, we will adjourn to our next meeting on November 17th here at the Veterans Hall. Thank you very much.